The morning begins with a slow tolling bell, each echo rolling through the fog-heavy air like a heartbeat in the chest of a sleeping world. A small medieval town stirs awake, its cobbled streets slick with dew and silence. But this is not a morning of prayer or labor. This is a morning of judgment. The mist hides faces, yet everyone knows why they've gathered. There's a tension in the air so thick it seems to hum beneath the sound of boots against stone. The people come in clusters: farmers, merchants, children clutching their mothers' skirts, all drawn by a morbid pull they both fear and crave. They form a loose circle around the wooden platform in the square, where a single figure waits, motionless, half-shrouded by the pale fog. He stands beside the block, his face hidden beneath a hood of coarse black cloth. His hands, scarred and steady, rest on the handle of an enormous axe whose edge gleams with an almost sacred sharpness. This is the executioner, the man who carries the weight of the town's sins, yet is never permitted to wash his own away. 4 days, whispers have followed him, of his past, of the blood that never quite leaves his hands, of the curse that follows those who serve death. The crowd watches him like a creature from a dream they can't wake from. The condemned man kneels beside the block. His breath trembles in the cold air. The priest murmurs a prayer too softly for anyone to hear, and the words vanish into the mist like ghosts. The executioner listens but does not bow his head. His duty is not prayer. His duty is precision. He knows the weight of the axe, the distance between his stance and the block, the sound the blade will make when it finds its mark. This is a performance of necessity, rehearsed in nightmares and perfected in solitude. Above them, ravens perch on the spire, watching with unblinking patience. They always come before the end, as if drawn by the certainty of death. The crowd shifts, restless. Somewhere, a child begins to cry. Someone else whispers a prayer for the man about to die, but not for the man who will kill him. No one ever prays for the executioner. The bell tolls again, slower now, as if counting down to the inevitable. The condemned man closes his eyes. His lips move, but no sound emerges. The executioner takes a breath, deep, even, resigned. He feels the familiar calm of ritual take over, the stillness that comes only in moments of finality. When the axe falls, the world seems to hold its breath. The sound that follows is not loud, but it echoes through every mind present. It is the sound of justice or vengeance, or simply the end. For a long time, no one moves. The air feels heavy, alive with a silence that no prayer can fill. Then, as though nothing had happened, the bell rings again, marking the close of the event. The priest makes the sign of the cross. The crowd begins to disperse, slowly at first, then all at once. Conversations resume in hushed tones. Children are led away. Merchants return to their stalls. The rhythm of life creeps back in, timidly, as if afraid to disturb what has just taken place. The executioner remains on the platform. He cleans his blade carefully, methodically, as he always does. Every movement is ritual, a way to separate himself from the act, to make the unspeakable seem like duty rather than sin. He does not look at the body, nor at the people who avert their gaze as they pass him. He knows what they whisper: cursed, damned, less than human. Yet he also knows that without him, their justice has no voice. When the square is empty, he lowers his hood. His face is ordinary, not monstrous, not cruel. Just tired. The eyes of a man who has seen too much of both guilt and fear. He wipes a streak of blood from his cheek and glances toward the rising sun. The light catches the axe's blade, and for a moment, it glows like gold. Then the wind shifts, and the glow fades into gray. He turns away, descending the steps quietly, his boots leaving faint prints in the damp earth. Behind him, the platform stands as a symbol, both sacred and profane, a reminder that every civilization builds its peace on someone else's burden. The bell tolls once more, distant now, marking not the end of a life, but the beginning of a story few ever tell. And as he walks back through the mist, the executioner disappears into the quiet heart of the waking town, carrying with him the unseen weight of his work, the invisible price of order, the silence of a man who has no place among the living, yet serves them all the same. Long before the figure of the hooded man with the axe appeared in town squares, the act of execution was woven deep into the story of human justice. In the earliest days of civilization, punishment and death were seen not as cruelty, but as balance, the restoration of order when chaos broke through the fragile structure of law. In the tribes of ancient Europe, justice was a family matter. Blood called for blood. The victim's kin became the executioner, and vengeance was sanctified by tradition. But as societies grew and rulers claimed divine authority, the right to kill in the name of justice passed from family to crown. Death became not personal but ceremonial. In the medieval world, justice was not an abstract idea written in law books. It was a performance, an act that reminded people who held power and who did not. The scaffold, the gallows, the wheel, these were not just instruments of punishment, but of order. To watch a man die publicly was to witness the invisible hand of authority. It told the crowd that sin could not hide, that crime would be met with equal force. It was both warning and reassurance. And so, society needed a hand to carry out that force. The executioner was born not from cruelty, but from necessity. Yet his role was cursed from the beginning. To take life, even under command, was to brush against sin. The Church taught that killing, even for justice, stained the soul. But kings and lords insisted that punishment was sacred, a divine act done in defense of morality. Between those beliefs stood one man, caught between salvation and damnation. The executioner existed in a moral gray no priest could cleanse. He was chosen, not celebrated. Often, he was a criminal spared the noose in exchange for a lifetime of service. His first act of mercy was also his last act of innocence. In many towns, no one wanted the job. When an execution was ordered and no man volunteered, the condemned himself might be offered freedom, if he would take the blade and become the next executioner. Others inherited it through bloodline, their children marked by their father's profession before they were even born. Once the choice was made, there was no return. It was as though the hand that first held the axe could never again be clean. The people needed him, but they despised him. The priest blessed his work yet refused him communion. The mayor paid his wages but would not shake his hand. He lived among them, yet apart from them, a shadow walking through daylight. They whispered that misfortune followed his path, that crops withered where his gaze fell, that his touch carried the cold of death itself. Mothers drew their children close when he passed, as if death might reach out and take them, too. And still, when the time came to cleanse the town of sin, it was his door they knocked on. Each kingdom had its way. In some places, executioners were state officials, their craft considered an art of precision and discipline. In others, they were nameless wanderers, moving from town to town, performing their work for coin before vanishing again into the wilderness. Yet everywhere, they bore the same mark, not on their skin, but in the eyes of others. The mark of fear. The paradox of their existence fascinated chroniclers and philosophers alike. How could a man serve justice and be condemned by it? The medieval mind was steeped in superstition, and executioners often became symbols of the unknown, half human, half omen. They were necessary instruments of divine order, yet living proof of humanity's darkest needs. In their presence, people were reminded of their own frailty, of how easily life could be taken, how quickly grace could turn to punishment. Execution was never only about death. It was theater, a ritual of morality acted out before the masses. The condemned confessed, the priest absolved, and the executioner performed the final act. It was meant to purify the community, to draw a line between the sinner and the righteous. But what no one admitted was that the crowd came not for redemption, but for spectacle. They came to see fear, to feel the thrill of punishment without the weight of guilt. In that sense, the executioner was not merely a servant of law. He was the performer who kept society's darkest hunger satisfied. As centuries passed, the profession became more structured. Cities began to appoint official executioners, granting them wages, housing, and authority. They learned techniques, honed their precision, and took pride in swift, clean deaths. Yet the curse of their role remained unchanged. No matter how vital their work, they were never invited into the world they preserved. Justice depended on them, but mercy never extended toward them. In this contradiction lies the true birth of the executioner's tragedy, a man who embodied both law and sin, both necessity and revulsion. He was the blade society sharpened yet refused to touch. And every swing of that blade echoed a truth no one dared to speak, that civilization itself was built upon the quiet labor of those condemned to bear its darkness. To become an executioner in the medieval world was not a matter of choice. It was a fate imposed, a sentence disguised as duty. No boy ever dreamed of wielding the axe, no man aspired to wear the hood. The path often began at the edge of a scaffold, with a condemned man offered a single terrible bargain: take up the blade that would have taken your life, and live instead as its servant. For some, it was survival. For others, it was a slow death stretched across years. The first moment an executioner held the weapon that would define him, he was reborn into a life of isolation and dread. He ceased to be part of humanity's circle and stepped into its shadow. Those who accepted the role did not do so freely. Many were criminals, thieves, deserters, or men disgraced beyond forgiveness. Their freedom came with iron conditions: the duty to execute justice without question, and to forever carry the mark of their profession. This mark was not symbolic. In many kingdoms, new executioners were branded by the authorities, a scar burned into the skin, a sign to all that they were now bound to death service. Others were made to swear sacred oaths, binding them by word before God. In that moment, their past life ended. Whatever family they had was lost to them, for to be the hand of death was to be cut away from the living. Training came not through books or mentors, but through observation and fear. The first lesson was silence, to obey orders without question, to never speak of what one saw or felt. The second was control. A clean beheading required not strength, but precision, one stroke, smooth and decisive, with no tremor of hesitation. The first failure could haunt a man forever. Some apprentices practiced for months on carcasses or bundles of straw, testing the weight of the blade, learning how muscle and bone yielded beneath steel. Others were thrust into the role without practice, their first act a trial by terror. If they faltered, they were jeered, sometimes beaten by the crowd, and forever shamed in the eyes of their peers. Over time, an executioner's hands learned a kind of dreadful grace. The weapon became an extension of his will. He could read the tension in a man's neck, feel the heartbeat before the blow, sense the difference between courage and despair. Yet no amount of skill erased the truth that he was despised for that mastery. To kill with precision was a kind of art, but an art the world could never admire. In some regions, the position became hereditary. A father's curse passed to his son, who learned from an early age that his bloodline carried the stain of death. These children grew up apart, playing only with siblings or others of their kind. Their homes were built near the edges of towns, where the air was quiet and no neighbors dared approach. They learned their craft as others might learn farming or trade, through repetition and necessity. But theirs was a profession that required not only skill, but endurance of the soul. Each act left an invisible wound. Each face remembered haunted their sleep. Among themselves, executioners formed small, silent brotherhoods. They were not bound by law, but by understanding, a kinship born of exile. They shared tools, methods, and sometimes mercy. In certain towns, they were responsible not only for executions but also for torture, mutilations, branding, and public punishments. They carried out the orders no one else dared fulfill. And though they were paid by kings and magistrates, their pay could never buy acceptance. No matter how loyal their service, they remained untouchable. The Church regarded them as necessary instruments of divine justice, yet refused them burial in consecrated ground. If they died, their bodies were laid to rest in unmarked plots, often near the places they had worked. Priests would bless their actions but not their souls. To live as an executioner was to exist between heaven and hell, performing sacred duties with damned hands. Many executioners became deeply religious in secret, praying nightly for forgiveness that never came. They lit candles for those they killed, whispering prayers into the darkness. But confession was forbidden, for who could absolve the hand that delivered death? There were moments, however, when humanity pierced the darkness. Some executioners took pity on their condemned, offering small mercies, a quick stroke instead of torture, a whispered word of comfort before the end. They might loosen a rope, dull a flame, or deliver a hidden blessing. These gestures never erased their sins, but they gave them a fragile sense of purpose. If they must be the agents of death, they would at least grant dignity to those they killed. The longer a man served, the heavier his silence became. He learned to hide his name, to move through the world unseen. When he entered a tavern, conversation stopped. When he bought bread, the baker's hands trembled. Children were warned not to look him in the eye, lest misfortune follow. The hood became both protection and prison, a mask that let him work without facing the scorn of those who demanded his service. Beneath it he was not a monster, only a man stripped of belonging. Still, there were those who found a grim pride in their role. Some took their duty as sacred justice, believing that God himself guided their hand. They sharpened their blades with care, studied anatomy, and refined their technique until their executions were swift, even merciful. They became professionals in a world of fear, turning death into order. Yet even the best of them knew, the cleaner the stroke, the deeper the curse. In every village there was a moment, often at dusk, when the executioner would walk home alone. His hands would still tremble, though he would not admit it. The scent of blood followed him like a shadow. Behind him, the townspeople would speak his name in whispers, their fear turning to stories that would outlive him. And in those stories, truth and superstition blended until the man himself vanished, leaving only the legend of the hooded figure, the bringer of judgment. To become an executioner was not to live, but to carry out a life sentence of solitude. Each blow of the axe was both an act of duty and a piece of himself falling away. In serving justice, he became the embodiment of society's darkest truth, that peace, order, and law were built not by saints, but by those willing to bear the burden of sin so others would not have to. Life as a medieval executioner was a strange paradox, one of both necessity and exile. He was the man every town depended on, yet no one wanted near. His work served kings, lords, and priests alike, but his presence was treated as pollution, a living reminder of death walking among the living. Wherever he went, the air seemed to change. People would fall silent, step aside, cross themselves as he passed. His clothes were plain, his manner unassuming, but the knowledge of what he did for a living clung to him like smoke. In a world obsessed with purity and sin, he was a man permanently stained. The executioner's home was almost always on the outskirts of town, often near the gallows or outside the city gates where criminals were buried. His dwelling was modest but well-kept. Necessity demanded self-sufficiency. He grew his own food, brewed his own ale, and tanned his own hides, for few would trade with him. Even when his pay was good, coin often meant little. No innkeeper wanted to share a table with him, no merchant wanted his money, no tailor wanted to measure his shoulders. He was invisible in daily life, tolerated only when his skills were required. The church, though willing to employ him, treated him as spiritually unclean. Priests would bless his acts but deny him the Eucharist. He could not stand among the congregation, nor touch holy relics. Some towns forbade executioners from entering the main church altogether, forcing them to pray outside, alone, through open doors. In this, his soul was as isolated as his body. He performed acts of divine justice, yet was denied divine mercy. The irony was not lost on him, though few dared speak it aloud. His neighbors, when he had any, kept their distance. Children were told not to look him in the eyes, for it was said that misfortune followed his gaze. Women made the sign of the cross if his shadow fell on their doorstep. Some claimed that flowers would not grow where his feet had tread, that animals grew restless in his presence. These were not truths, but fears made flesh, fears of mortality, of judgment, of the reminder that all men eventually stood before death. The executioner simply bore that reminder on his face every day. And yet his pay was steady and his work secure. While farmers starved in harsh winters, the executioner's family rarely went hungry. He received wages from the city, sometimes supplemented by a portion of the condemned man's belongings. In a cruel twist of fate, the man shunned by all often lived more comfortably than many who despised him. But his wealth brought no peace. Markets would refuse his coin, forcing him to send family members to buy goods on his behalf. His children, marked by their father's trade, grew up ostracized, their futures predetermined by fear and superstition. Marriage was a challenge of its own. Most women refused even to speak with an executioner, let alone wed one. In many towns, they were allowed to marry only within their own kind, other executioners' families, criminals, or outcasts. The result was a generation of isolated bloodlines, bound together by necessity rather than choice. These small communities of cursed families lived in quiet clusters outside the town walls, forming a society within a society, one that carried both the burden of service and the stigma of sin. Despite the scorn he faced, the executioner's duties extended far beyond the scaffold. He was often called upon to perform unpleasant but vital civic tasks. He disposed of carcasses, cleaned plague pits, and handled the bodies of those no one else would touch. When disease struck, he was among the few willing to dig graves or burn infected homes. He was part of the machinery that kept society functioning, though always from the shadows. The people might spit at him in the street, yet prayed he would not fall ill, for who else would do the work he did? Some executioners found a strange solace in routine. Their homes were tidy, their tools meticulously maintained, their lives ordered with the discipline of men who had seen chaos too closely. There was a quiet dignity in their isolation, a sense that if they must be cut off from the world, they would at least master their small corner of it. Their gardens grew lush, their workshops gleamed with polished iron, their records kept precise. In this way, they preserved some control over a life that was otherwise ruled by fate and fear. There were, of course, those who broke beneath the weight. Some drowned their guilt in ale, spending their pay in dim taverns that tolerated their presence. Others succumbed to madness, haunted by the faces of the condemned. It was said that executioners often aged quickly, their hair whitening long before their years. Their nightmares were vivid and repetitive, the same faces, the same final cries, replaying in endless procession. When they walked through the square where they had worked, they sometimes felt the air grow heavier, as if the souls they'd sent onward lingered nearby. Still, not all lived in misery. Some accepted their role as divine justice in human form. They reasoned that someone must do the work others could not bear. Their faith, however twisted by necessity, gave them purpose. They believed that God, not they, passed judgment. They were merely the instruments. And though they would never be celebrated, they found comfort in the certainty of duty. Theirs was a grim peace, but peace nonetheless. Over the years, familiarity dulled the town's outrage. The people learned to live with the executioner's presence, just as they lived with storms or sickness. He was not spoken to, but neither was he always feared. When he passed through the market, people averted their eyes but did not flee. When he stood in the square, the space around him emptied, but no one threw stones. It was as though his existence had become another fact of life, unpleasant, inevitable, and quietly accepted. At night, when the town fell silent, the executioner would sometimes stand at his doorway, looking toward the faint glow of the church steeple. The wind would carry the distant echo of bells, and he would think of the lives he'd ended and the prayers he'd never been allowed to speak. In those moments, the divide between him and the rest of humanity felt endless, not measured by distance, but by silence. And yet, deep down, he understood something no one else dared to, that justice, purity, and safety all demanded a shadow to protect them. He was that shadow, despised, necessary, and utterly alone. In the executioner's dimly lit workshop, the air smelled of iron, oil, and old wood. This was his domain, a place forbidden to others, a sanctum of precision and dread. The tools of his trade rested neatly on the table: blades, ropes, chains, hammers, tongs, and saws. Each one had its purpose, each one carried its own history. They were not weapons of war or symbols of power, they were instruments of law, crafted to deliver death in its many sanctioned forms. To outsiders, they were objects of horror. To the executioner, they were the only companions that never turned away. The most sacred of all was the sword or the axe, depending on region and custom. A beheading sword was long, heavy, and straight-edged, made not for battle but for justice. The edge had to be flawless, honed by candlelight until it gleamed like liquid silver. Executioners would test their blades on bundles of reeds or thin sheets of parchment, listening to the sound each cut made. A clean, low whisper meant perfection. Some men named their blades, carving initials or holy symbols into the steel, as though binding their souls to the instrument that defined them. The axe, by contrast, was heavier, its broad head designed to sever with brute force rather than finesse. A skilled executioner could use either with deadly accuracy, but each demanded a different rhythm, one of precision, the other of power. Hanging was the most common punishment in much of medieval Europe, simple in design but deceptive in its cruelty. The executioner's rope was often handmade, woven from hemp and soaked in water to prevent fraying. The knot's placement determined whether the condemned died quickly or slowly. A well-tied noose and a measured drop could break the neck in an instant. A merciful death. But a poorly calculated fall meant strangulation, a slow, gasping struggle that might last minutes. The executioner was expected to know this balance, to measure a man's weight and adjust accordingly. It was not art for beauty's sake, but art in service of ending pain swiftly, if not kindly. Then there was the wheel, the most feared of all instruments. Used for the crime of murder or treason, it was both execution and spectacle. The condemned was bound to a great wooden wheel, limbs stretched across its spokes. The executioner would then break the bones one by one with an iron bar, following a specific sequence prescribed by law. The final blow, the coup de grace, was delivered to the chest or throat, granting release. To the crowd, it was a performance of divine wrath. To the executioner, it was a test of endurance, both physical and moral. Afterward, the broken body was left displayed as warning, the wheel turning slowly in the wind like a grim banner of justice. For crimes of heresy or witchcraft, fire became the chosen element. The executioner's duty began not with the flame, but with the preparation, binding the condemned, stacking the wood, calculating how the wind would carry the smoke. The condemned were often strangled or given a final blessing before the fire was lit, but not always. The executioner would ignite the pyre with practiced detachment, his expression unreadable. The flames rose, the crowd gasped, and the air filled with the scent of burning resin and fear. The act was as much ritual as punishment, intended to cleanse the soul and purify the sin. Yet for the man holding the torch, it was another scar upon the conscience. Not all of his tools were instruments of death. Many were designed for pain, whips, brands, and irons used to mark, mutilate, or shame. Branding irons, heated until they glowed red, left symbols of guilt upon flesh, a thief's hand, an adulterer's cheek, a deserter's shoulder. The executioner's steady hand was required not to kill but to scar, to inscribe judgment into the body itself. In these moments, he became not only the hand of death, but the scribe of punishment. His craft extended beyond killing. It shaped fear into obedience. Maintenance of these instruments was an unspoken ritual. After each execution, the tools were cleaned meticulously, not only to preserve them but to separate the act from the man. Water, ash, and oil were used in slow, deliberate motions, as if each stroke could erase the memory of what had just occurred. Some executioners recited prayers during the cleaning, whispering to themselves or to the spirits of those who had fallen beneath their hand. In this way, the tools became sacred in their own dark manner, symbols of both guilt and absolution. Despite their reputation, executioners were not reckless but exacting. Precision meant everything. A single miscalculation could turn an execution into chaos. Too many blows of the axe, and the crowd would grow restless, even violent. A rope that failed to break the neck might provoke pity for the condemned and hatred for the man who tied it. Each task required calmness, control, and a strange kind of compassion, for in their world, mercy was measured not by saving a life, but by ending it swiftly. There was also the ceremonial aspect of their work. In some cities, the executioner dressed in specific garments: a black tunic, leather gloves, a hood. The clothing served not just to conceal his face, but to mark the act as official. It transformed the moment of death into a state function, the hand of the ruler acting through the body of a man. Sometimes, the condemned would kneel and tip the executioner a few coins, a final gesture of respect or plea for a clean death. The executioner, bound by custom, accepted the coin silently. It was said that if he refused it, the soul of the condemned would wander forever. Over years of service, the tools began to carry memories. The grooves in the axe handle, the worn edges of the rope, the dark stains that could never be fully washed away, each told a story. They bore witness to hundreds of judgments, hundreds of endings. When the executioner looked upon them, he saw not just instruments, but history itself, the law made tangible, the will of men and kings carved into steel and wood. And yet, in the quiet after each execution, when the crowd dispersed and the world fell silent, the tools seemed almost alive. The blade gleamed faintly in the fading light, the rope swayed in the breeze, the wheel creaked softly as it turned. To anyone else, these sounds would chill the blood. To the executioner, they were the echoes of purpose, grim, necessary, eternal. He knew that without these instruments, justice would falter, fear would fade, and chaos would return. In that realization lay his only comfort. He was not a monster, but a craftsman of mortality, the caretaker of order. His tools were his truth, his burden, and his legacy. They would outlive him, passed from hand to hand, each new wielder inheriting not only the steel, but the silence that came with it. For as long as men demanded justice, the tools of death would never truly rest. The executioner's home was not like that of other men. It stood apart, often near the edge of town or by the gates where the gallows loomed against the sky. His door was closed to most, his name whispered only when necessary. The walls around his dwelling were thick, not to keep danger out, but to keep judgment from seeping in. Inside, life unfolded in uneasy quiet, a life both ordinary and cursed. The smell of smoke and iron clung to everything, a faint reminder that even in his moments of rest, death was never far. Neighbors seldom approached. Children were warned not to look him in the eye. Market stalls would go silent when he passed, conversations trailing off mid-sentence. Even those who owed him favors, for the executioner also served as healer, bone-setter, or grave-digger, refused to break bread at his table. His shadow stretched further than his figure, darkening every threshold he crossed. Yet, behind that shroud of fear lived a man like any other, with hunger, fatigue, and longing. He had learned to survive in solitude, to find meaning where others saw only curse. His family, if he had one, bore the same burden. Wives of executioners were often shunned, their children mocked or forbidden from attending church. Many grew up believing they carried their father's stain, that their very blood bore the weight of the condemned. In some towns, their marriages had to take place outside church grounds. In others, priests refused them holy rites altogether. The family lived in the space between necessity and rejection, essential to society's order, yet exiled from its heart. Still, they found ways to exist. The executioner's wife tended to herbs and poultices, for healing was a trade that balanced death. She might deliver babies in the night or mend wounds for those too poor to see a physician. Her hands, though shunned by some, saved lives as her husband ended them. Their children grew accustomed to silence, to the stares that followed them in the marketplace. They learned resilience early, the art of enduring contempt without returning it. When the city needed them, the family was summoned. When peace returned, they were forgotten. There were moments of grim irony. On feast days, when the town celebrated with laughter and drink, the executioner's home remained quiet. He would watch from a distance, the glow of lanterns flickering like stars, the sound of music carried on the wind. He might raise a cup in solitude, toasting a world that depended on his hand yet despised his presence. He understood the hypocrisy but did not resent it. To hate them back would make him no different from those he punished. Instead, he accepted his isolation as part of his duty, the price paid for balance in a cruel and fragile world. Occasionally, a knock would come at his door. Not from the townsfolk, but from travelers, outcasts, or the desperate. Those in pain, those who had nowhere else to go. They came seeking remedies for broken bones, fevers, or wounds that would not heal. The executioner never turned them away. His knowledge of the body, its joints, its sinews, its fragility, made him a surprisingly skilled healer. The same precision that guided his acts now guided his hands toward mercy. In these quiet acts, he found a strange redemption. Despite his reputation, he was not without faith. Many executioners kept a small altar at home, candles flickering beside crude wooden crosses or icons of saints. Some prayed before every execution, asking forgiveness not for their actions, but for what their actions might turn them into. Others prayed after, when the world was still, hoping that the souls of the dead might find peace before they themselves were swallowed by guilt. Faith was their fragile bridge between duty and despair, a reminder that even the hand of death could tremble in reverence before God. At night, when all was silent, memories would come unbidden. The faces of the condemned, the final words, the trembling prayers. Some begged, others cursed, a few smiled as though relieved. Their voices lingered in dreams, sometimes blending with the moan of the wind or the creak of the gallows outside. The executioner would wake in cold sweat, heart pounding, hand instinctively reaching for the rosary or blade at his bedside. Sleep seldom came easy. Yet, in the dark hours before dawn, he found a strange kind of peace, a stillness that belonged only to those who had faced death too often to fear it anymore. His children, too, lived in the shadow of his work. Some followed in his footsteps, taking the trade by inheritance. Others fled as soon as they could, seeking towns where their family name was unknown. The profession passed from father to son not by pride but by necessity. Society needed executioners, yet no one wanted to become one. Thus, the role perpetuated through bloodline, each generation bound by duty and ostracism alike. To refuse the calling was to abandon one's only livelihood. To accept it was to embrace eternal solitude. Still, there were rare moments of normalcy. On quiet mornings, the executioner might sit outside, sharpening his blade while the world still slept. Birds would sing in the distance, the sky pale with dawn. His wife would tend to the garden, her hands working the soil as though coaxing life back into the earth. For a few minutes, they were just a family, neither cursed nor feared, simply alive. Then the church bell would toll, calling the town to prayer or judgment, and the illusion would fade. The townsfolk's fear, though cruel, had reason. In the medieval mind, death was not an end but a passage, and those who dealt in it too often were believed to walk between worlds. The executioner was thought to carry traces of the condemned souls, whispers that clung to his spirit like smoke. Some said his touch could blight crops or sicken livestock. Others claimed he saw omens in dreams, signs of those soon to die. Whether superstition or truth, such beliefs made him both feared and necessary, a man forever standing on the border between justice and damnation. And yet, there was nobility in his endurance. The executioner bore the sins of others so that the rest could remain pure. He was the vessel through which society expelled its darkness. Without him, vengeance would rule and chaos would reign. His solitude was not punishment but purpose, a sacrifice that few could understand, fewer still could bear. Behind his silence lay a strength forged not from cruelty, but from the acceptance of what must be done when no one else will. As he looked out at the town from the edge of his property, the spires, the smoke, the distant laughter, he felt both a part and essential. They would never thank him, but he did not need their gratitude. The weight he carried was his own, and he bore it with quiet dignity. For in a world ruled by fear, someone had to carry the burden of death so that others could sleep untroubled. And that, perhaps, was the truest form of service. In the medieval world, execution day was not merely a punishment, it was an event. From the moment the decree was read aloud in the town square, anticipation rippled through the streets like a dark tide. Words spread quickly, from the blacksmith's forge to the baker's stall, to the children playing in the alleys. An execution, they whispered, eyes bright with morbid curiosity. For most, it was the only spectacle they would see in months, a grim performance that blurred the line between justice and entertainment. The gallows or scaffold would be built days in advance, often in the town's busiest square, or on a hill where the entire community could watch. As carpenters hammered and guards took their posts, the air grew heavier. justice was coming, and all would bear witness. By dawn, the crowd began to gather. Farmers left their fields, merchants closed their shops, and families arrived as though attending a fair. Some came out of duty, others out of fascination, and some, though they'd never admit it, came for the thrill. The square buzzed with the sound of voices, vendors shouting as they sold food, ale, or small trinkets to mark the occasion. The smell of roasting meat mingled with that of sweat and fear. To the medieval mind, death was a constant companion, but public executions gave form to that fear, made it tangible, visible, controllable. Watching the condemned die reminded them that sin had consequence, that order was upheld by the blade and the rope. When the church bells tolled, silence rippled through the crowd. The procession began. First came the guards, their armor glinting in the morning light, clearing a path through the onlookers. Behind them, a priest walked with solemn dignity, clutching a crucifix and murmuring prayers. And finally, the condemned appeared, bound and pale, flanked by the executioner. The prisoner's steps were slow, heavy with finality. Some cried or shouted, pleading for mercy. Others remained eerily calm, lips moving in silent prayer. A few, defiant to the end, spat at the crowd or cursed the authorities. Their words hung in the air like sparks before being swallowed by the collective murmur of the masses. The executioner moved with a different gravity. Hooded or bare-faced, he was both feared and vital. His steps were steady, his posture unshaken. In that moment, he was not a man but an instrument, the embodiment of the law's cold will. The crowd watched him with both dread and fascination. Some crossed themselves as he passed, whispering prayers to ward off his shadow. Yet none could look away. For them, he was the final thread between chaos and order, between sin and redemption. The priest offered last rites, his voice rising over the hush. The condemned might confess, beg forgiveness, or proclaim innocence. Every word was fuel for gossip, every tear or defiant laugh a story to be told for weeks. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the act itself. Whether it was the swing of a sword, the drop of the rope, or the roar of flames, time seemed to slow. The crowd held its breath. The executioner's hands moved with practiced certainty, a fluid precision that only years of duty could produce. A clean strike, a swift drop, these were marks of honor, even respect. But if the blow faltered or the rope snapped, the atmosphere changed instantly. Gasps turned to jeers, prayers to curses. The same people who cheered his skill could just as easily turn on him, demanding another strike, another blow, as though their thirst for justice, or spectacle, had not yet been sated. When the deed was done, silence hung for a heartbeat before the noise returned, louder than ever. Some applauded. Others muttered about the condemned sins or debated whether the punishment fit the crime. The priest crossed himself once more, and the guards dispersed the restless crowd. For many, the spectacle was over. They would return to their homes, to supper and chores, speaking of the execution as though it were a play they had seen. Yet, for the executioner, it was not so easily forgotten. He would remain behind to ensure the ritual was completed properly, the body displayed if required by law, or buried in unhallowed ground if denied Christian rites. Sometimes, the condemned's head was placed on a pike as warning to others, staring blankly over the city walls. The executioner supervised every detail, not out of cruelty, but out of obligation. The act had to be carried out according to custom, for any deviation risked more than disapproval, it risked divine wrath. Justice, to the medieval mind, was sacred business. To fail in its delivery was to disturb the balance between heaven and earth. When the crowd had gone, the square felt emptier than before. The air carried the faint smell of blood and burnt oil. The scaffold stood silent, the wood darkened by use. The executioner, now alone, removed his gloves and hood. Sweat slicked his brow, and his breath came slow and heavy. He would clean his tools, say a quiet prayer, and return home through streets that would part for him like the sea. No one would speak to him, though everyone would know what he had done. For the people, justice had been served. For him, another soul had passed through his hands. Public executions were theater, ritual and control disguised as justice. They reinforced authority, made examples of sinners, and reminded the living of their mortality. Rulers understood their power well. The sight of the condemned humbled the proud and silenced dissent. Every lash, every flame, every falling blade was a sermon on obedience. And yet, beneath that order lay contradiction. The same crowd that shouted justice also fed on cruelty. They cheered at each spurt of blood, each final gasp, their own fear momentarily transformed into fascination. Death, so feared in private, became entertainment in public. For the condemned, it was a strange end. Some sought redemption in their final moments, making peace with their fate. Others met death with fury or laughter, refusing to grant their captors satisfaction. The executioner had seen all kinds: the repentant thief who kissed the rope before his neck broke, the noble who forgave his killers, the witch who spat a curse as the flames took her. Each left behind a fragment of story etched into the memory of the man who ended them. For him, every execution was a mirror, showing not only the face of the condemned, but of humanity itself. As dusk fell and the last spectators departed, only the wind remained to stir the silence. The executioner would take one last look at the scaffold before turning away. Tomorrow, life in the town would resume: laughter, trade, and prayer as though nothing had happened. But he would carry the weight of what had transpired long after the echoes of the crowd had faded. For the people it was justice. For him, it was duty. And between those two words lay a lifetime of quiet torment. The executioner's relationship with the condemned was a complex tapestry of fear, pity, and grim duty. In a medieval town, no two moments on the scaffold were ever the same. Some prisoners arrived frantic, their eyes wide with terror, mouths trembling with pleas for mercy. Others walked with stoic calm, accepting the inevitability of death as though it were a natural end to a long, hard life. The executioner learned quickly that each person demanded a different approach. One wrong word, one hesitation, and panic could consume both the condemned and the crowd. His work was not only physical but psychological, a careful dance between authority and empathy. Before the final act, he often had to prepare the condemned. This could mean binding wrists and ankles with ropes, ensuring that chains did not cut into flesh unnecessarily. Sometimes it involved adjusting the neck for the rope or helping the prisoner onto a platform in the correct posture. These small motions, repeated countless times, became an intricate ritual, one designed to make the execution swift and the suffering minimal. Yet, even in such controlled conditions, the air was thick with tension. The condemned would glance around at the crowd, noting familiar faces, or perhaps staring at nothing at all, as if already leaving the world behind. The words exchanged between executioner and prisoner were sparse, often unnecessary. Yet in some cases, a whisper could ease terror. The executioner might speak gently, reminders of faith, advice to pray, or simply quiet assurance that the moment of pain would be brief. For the condemned, these words could be balm to the spirit, however fleeting. For the executioner, they were a reminder that his role, though dreaded by all, had a human element, a fleeting connection that few others would ever experience. Some condemned were defiant. Noblemen accused of treason, peasants who had resisted feudal law, or those accused of heinous crimes might scorn the executioner openly. They would spit, shout, or curse, attempting to assert control in a moment when all control had been stripped away. In these cases, the executioner's skill extended beyond physical precision. He had to remain calm, to move with authority yet without cruelty, to ensure the act was performed without resistance and without error. Every swing of the axe or tightening of the rope was calculated, executed with the precision born of years of practice. Mercy, when it came, was subtle. A skilled executioner could minimize suffering with the placement of a noose, the angle of a blade, or the timing of a drop. Such gestures were never celebrated publicly. Indeed, they were often invisible to the onlookers. Yet privately, they were acts of compassion, small victories in a life otherwise dominated by death. Some executioners would whisper prayers for the condemned soul, lighting a candle or touching a mark of faith on the body before the final act. These secret rituals became essential, offering a sliver of humanity in an occupation otherwise defined by fear and isolation. Executioners were also tasked with observing law and ritual. In some towns, failing to follow the prescribed methods of punishment could lead to scandal or accusation. A botched hanging or poorly executed beheading could be interpreted as negligence, incompetence, or even divine disfavor. Thus, the executioner's work was a balancing act. Physical skill, ritual knowledge, and psychological acuity all combined to ensure the act was precise, authoritative, and legally valid. It was a responsibility heavier than any blade he might lift. Beyond the act itself, the aftermath weighed heavily on him. Once the condemned was gone, the executioner sometimes had to manage the body, confirming death, removing it for burial, or preparing it for public display as a warning to others. He moved quietly, performing tasks that few would ever touch. In these moments, the gravity of his position became acute. Every motion carried moral and social weight, and the town depended on him to maintain order even in the silence that followed violence. The condemned left traces, both visible and invisible. The cries, the final glares, and even the silent resignation became imprinted in the executioner's memory. He carried them home, tucked behind his thoughts like unspoken companions. Over time, these memories compounded, layering on top of one another until sleep sometimes became uneasy. Dreams were haunted by faces he had touched, bodies he had guided into death, and the heavy, inexorable pull of mortality that he alone witnessed so intimately. Yet, despite the isolation and fear, the executioner's work was strangely social. He was connected to the rhythms of the town, the pulse of justice, and the moral structure of medieval life. His hands delivered not only punishment but also reassurance, to the authorities that laws were enforced, to the populace that sin had consequence, and to the church that divine justice was enacted through mortal hands. In this way, each condemned individual became part of a larger story, one in which the executioner was the quiet, unacknowledged narrator. Some condemned found dignity in the final moments. A repentant sinner might bow his head, muttering prayers. A proud nobleman might raise his chin, facing death with defiance. A guilty thief might clutch his chest, wincing at the last pangs of fear and regret. The executioner observed all of these with detachment tempered by empathy. Though his role demanded distance, he could not remain entirely unaffected by the weight of life passing through his hands. Each execution left a subtle mark, a shadow on the conscience that lingered long after the square had emptied. In some cases, the condemned offered small gestures, a coin, a nod of respect, a whispered thanks. These were rare, but profoundly human. The executioner, who existed outside society yet enforced its rules, recognized these moments as fleeting glimpses of understanding between two souls meeting at the boundary between life and death. Such gestures reminded him that his role, though cursed in the eyes of many, had its own quiet significance. Ultimately, the relationship between executioner and condemned was a reflection of society itself, complex, paradoxical, and fraught with moral tension. The executioner embodied the law, fear, and necessity, while the condemned embodied sin, choice, and mortality. In the square, these two forces met, observed by a crowd that understood neither fully. The act of execution, brutal yet ritualized, revealed the fragile balance upon which medieval life rested. It was a daily reminder that justice, mercy, and fear were inseparable, and that the man who carried out justice walked a line few could comprehend. The executioner's life was not only defined by the condemned but also by the rituals and superstitions that surrounded him. In medieval towns, death was never a private affair. It was a visible, communal, and highly symbolic act. The executioner existed at the center of these rituals, a figure simultaneously feared, relied upon, and shunned. His presence was a reminder that the boundary between life and death was narrow and fragile, and that the law demanded a keeper of that boundary. Every step he took, every tool he touched, carried layers of meaning, both practical and mystical. To the townspeople, he was a man intertwined with fate itself, a walking symbol of divine judgment made flesh. Superstition surrounded almost every aspect of his existence. It was believed that executioners carried a taint of death on their bodies, a shadow of the souls they had guided from the living world. Some claimed their touch could bring misfortune, their shadow could wither crops, or their gaze could curse livestock. Children were warned not to point at them, dogs would grow restless in their presence, and even animals seemed to sense the unnatural weight they bore. For the executioner, such beliefs were both a curse and a protection. While they reinforced isolation, they also deterred unwanted interactions, giving him a kind of enforced space in which to live and work. Ritual played a critical role in mitigating fear and maintaining order. Before every execution, the square was prepared meticulously. Chalk lines marked where the condemned would stand, ropes were measured, scaffolds were inspected. Bells tolled at precise intervals, signaling the readiness of the executioner and the inevitability of what was to come. Priests recited prayers, asking for the soul of the condemned to find salvation, and townsfolk crossed themselves, murmuring invocations to ward off evil. In these moments, the executioner was not only performing a civic duty but participating in a sacred choreography, a dance of mortality observed by all, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble. Despite the fear that surrounded him, the executioner developed his own routines to manage the psychological weight of his role. Many kept prayer books, rosaries, or small charms hidden in their homes. Some recited psalms before and after an execution, seeking absolution for the acts that society demanded. Others developed rituals entirely their own, cleaning their tools in a specific order, inspecting the rope thrice, or touching a symbol of faith before taking a life. These acts provided a fragile sense of control, a means to reconcile the moral and emotional burden of work that few could understand. Isolation was not only social but spatial. Executioners were often forced to live outside the city walls, near the gallows, or in small cottages on the outskirts. Their families endured similar marginalization, with children forbidden from attending church or joining common society. Wives of executioners often became midwives or healers, roles that allowed them to serve the community while remaining at a safe distance. Their homes were fortified in subtle ways, walls thick with stone, doors heavy, windows small. Inside, life proceeded with quiet order, gardens tended, tools maintained, meals prepared. Yet always, the shadow of the work outside their walls lingered, an inescapable presence shaping their every action. The townspeople's rituals reflected both fascination and fear. They attended executions in part as moral lesson, in part as spectacle. Children mimicked the gestures they saw, adults whispered about sins and justice, and merchants sold food and trinkets to the crowds. These communal behaviors reinforced the executioner's centrality to medieval life. He was simultaneously the agent of law and the embodiment of the consequences of breaking it. Without him, these rituals would collapse. With him, society was reminded of its fragile order, and each act of punishment became a shared narrative, a collective memory etched into the town's consciousness. The executioner also played a role in purifying the town after an execution. Blood was washed from the scaffold, tools were cleaned with care, and the condemned's body was either interred or displayed according to law. Each motion, however mundane, carried symbolic weight. It was believed that neglecting these tasks could result in spiritual unrest or divine punishment. The executioner's meticulous attention to detail ensured not only the efficiency of his work but the spiritual and social stability of the town. In essence, he was both enforcer and caretaker, guardian of moral and physical order. Rumors and stories grew around executioners, their deeds exaggerated over time. Some were said to have extraordinary strength or supernatural intuition, able to sense guilt in a man's bones or foresee an impending death in a distant village. Others were accused of secret cruelty, inventing tortures beyond the law. While most of these tales were fanciful, they reflected the community's need to explain what was otherwise terrifying and incomprehensible. In reality, the executioner's power was mundane yet absolute, the ability to enforce law, to act where society's fear paralyzed others, and to carry the burden of mortality with a steady hand. At night, the executioner's life was marked by reflection. The square emptied, the scaffold stood silent, and the sounds of the town faded into distance. He would tend to his tools, speak a quiet prayer, or simply sit and observe the moonlit fields beyond his home. The isolation, though imposed, allowed a rare kind of contemplation. He pondered the lives he had ended, the sins he had witnessed, and the fragile balance that kept society functioning. In these hours, the executioner's work revealed its deeper truth. He was not merely a harbinger of death, but a silent guardian of the delicate weave of law, morality, and order. Though feared, the executioner often understood more about life than those who judged him. He saw courage in the condemned, piety in the desperate, and resignation in the guilty. He understood human frailty intimately, witnessing both the darkest impulses and the quietest virtues. In this sense, his isolation was paradoxical. The world shunned him for his work, yet he possessed a clarity about human nature that few could claim. His insight was a hidden treasure, one born of proximity to mortality that most would never endure. Ultimately, the executioner existed in a world of contradictions. He was necessary yet despised, feared yet relied upon, alienated yet central. Superstition and ritual intertwined with the stark reality of death, creating a life both disciplined and haunted. To live as an executioner was to walk a tightrope suspended between mortality and morality, between fear and necessity. And though he bore the curse of isolation and the weight of every life ended by his hand, he did so with quiet dignity, understanding that his work preserved a fragile equilibrium upon which the entire medieval world depended. The life of a medieval executioner was a constant negotiation with morality, reputation, and the laws of both man and God. Unlike soldiers or mercenaries, whose violence was sanctioned by battle, executioners wielded death in peacetime, under the scrutiny of their communities. Their hands ended life deliberately, methodically, and often publicly. Every act was weighed with consequence, not only for the condemned but for the broader society that watched, judged, and internalized the lessons of mortality. The executioner was both feared and necessary, a man whose role exposed the fragility of social order and the tenuous balance between sin and justice. Each day, he carried this duality as a heavy, invisible burden. In towns large and small, rumors about executioners abounded. They were said to possess unnatural knowledge of the human body, an eerie precision in their movements, and a detachment from suffering that bordered on inhuman. Children would hide behind their mothers' skirts, whispering about the man who could end a life with a single swing of his axe or a carefully measured drop. Peasants and merchants alike treated him with cautious respect, offering small gestures, a bow, a nod, a coin, to avoid invoking his shadow. This combination of fear and reverence shaped his entire existence. To live as an executioner was to exist perpetually outside ordinary society, both indispensable and ostracized. The professional tools of his trade were extensions of his body and mind, instruments of exacting precision. Each blade, rope, and iron had been maintained meticulously, honed over countless executions to perform without error. Before each task, the executioner checked the rope's knots, tested the swing of the axe, and examined the scaffold for stability. There was no room for improvisation or failure. A single miscalculation could turn a clean death into agony, bringing shame upon him and disrupting the town's sense of order. In this, the executioner's craft was both mechanical and deeply moral, a balance of technique, experience, and ethical judgment. The condemned themselves were human puzzles, each with a unique story, temperament, and final wish. Some arrived terrified, others defiant, some resigned to their fate. The executioner needed to read them quickly, adjusting his methods not just for efficiency, but for maintaining order and ensuring a minimum of suffering. The act of execution was a ritual of precision, but also one of subtle psychological navigation. Words were measured, gestures controlled, and timing became a form of silent compassion. He learned that even in death, dignity could be preserved or stripped entirely, depending on the smallest actions. Hanging, beheading, and the wheel were not simply means of ending life. They were performances of law, morality, and ritual. The executioner understood this intimately. A rope too short, a drop miscalculated, or a blade swung unevenly could reverberate far beyond the condemned's life, influencing public perception, religious interpretation, and the credibility of authority. Every execution was a lesson in obedience, fear, and divine justice, broadcast in vivid detail to a captivated audience. For the executioner, mastery over both his tools and the human element was essential to uphold the fragile social contract. Isolation was both imposed and self-enforced. The executioner's family often shared his burden, their lives constrained by stigma and necessity. Children were wary of friendships, wives endured whispered slights and restricted social engagement. Within their home, the executioner and his family developed routines and rituals to create a semblance of normalcy. Meals were structured, tools maintained, prayers recited, and small gestures of humanity preserved. A shared laugh, a story at the hearth, the tending of a garden. These moments offered reprieve from the oppressive weight of death that hovered over every corner of their lives. Despite the omnipresence of death, the executioner's role extended to aspects of care and mercy. He often doubled as a healer, bonesetter, or midwife in the community. His knowledge of anatomy, gained through experience and observation, allowed him to mend broken limbs, treat wounds, and soothe suffering. In this duality, his life was paradoxical, a bringer of death who also preserved life, a figure of fear who offered aid when needed. These acts of compassion were invisible to most, yet they provided the executioner with a sense of purpose beyond mere enforcement of the law. Superstition and ritual intertwined with his daily existence. He observed prayers before each execution, sometimes reciting psalms or blessing his tools. Legends suggested that neglecting these small rituals could bring misfortune or divine disfavor. In addition, certain superstitions dictated where he could walk, whom he could touch, and how he could interact with the living. These customs reinforced isolation, but they also provided a structured framework for navigating a life immersed in fear and mortality. The executioner learned to respect these invisible rules as much as the tangible laws of man. The psychological burden of repeated exposure to death was immense. Executioners carried the faces, voices, and last words of the condemned long after the crowds had gone. Sleep was often uneasy, haunted by nightmares or quiet recollections of acts performed in daylight. Yet, over time, endurance shaped a form of resilience, a calm born not of cruelty, but of necessity. The executioner learned to compartmentalize, separating his duties from his personal conscience, and creating space for reflection, ritual, and spiritual sustenance. Despite societal fear and scorn, the executioner's work was deeply interwoven with the fabric of the town. He ensured that justice was visible, consequences immediate, and social order maintained. The crowd might not understand him, but they relied on him, just as rulers, clergy, and magistrates did. In his hands, the laws of men and the perceived justice of God found tangible expression. His presence validated authority and reminded the community that every action had consequence, that morality was enforced, and that sin bore punishment. Ultimately, the executioner's life was one of paradoxes, hated yet indispensable, feared yet respected, isolated yet central to the functioning of society. Every act, every ritual, every interaction reflected the intricate balance of medieval life, between justice and mercy, life and death, human frailty and the immutable demands of law. Though cursed by reputation and shadowed by mortality, the executioner endured, carrying out his duties with precision, discipline, and an unacknowledged dignity that ensured the survival of order in a chaotic world. The executioner's work extended far beyond the scaffold. It permeated every aspect of his existence, shaping both his public persona and private life. In a medieval town, where superstition and law intertwined, he was simultaneously a necessary agent of order and a figure of dread. Children would peek from behind doors, whispering tales of his strength and fearsome skill, while adults offered cautious nods or hurried greetings in the marketplace. His reputation preceded him, and that reputation dictated his interactions. Even when not actively performing an execution, he was a living symbol of mortality, a reminder that life could be taken swiftly and often publicly. Daily life for the executioner was structured around preparation, ritual, and observation. He maintained his tools with meticulous care, for any lapse could result in error, shame, or public outrage. The axe was sharpened, ropes examined for fraying, scaffolds inspected for stability. Each task, though repetitive, carried immense weight. Beyond the physical readiness, he prepared mentally, rehearsing movements, imagining contingencies, and reflecting on the moral weight of what he must do. In this preparation, there was an artistry, an almost meditative focus that combined precision, discipline, and an acute awareness of life's fragility. Interactions with townsfolk were complicated. Some approached him out of necessity, to request aid for a sick family member, to seek advice, or to hire him for secondary roles such as bonesetting or grave digging. These interactions required careful navigation. He was both feared and indispensable. Many tried to maintain distance, yet their survival or comfort often depended on him. His presence reminded the community of its dependence on him while simultaneously reinforcing their social and psychological boundaries. Even in mundane encounters, the executioner existed as a liminal figure, part of the town's everyday rhythm yet set apart by the nature of his work. The condemned often left indelible marks on his consciousness. He witnessed fear, defiance, repentance, and resignation in their final moments. Each execution carried its own narrative, its own subtle drama, and the executioner had to respond with both precision and emotional intelligence. Timing a drop, adjusting a blade, or offering a quiet word of comfort required not just skill but empathy. For some condemned, the executioner became a final point of human contact, a mediator between the living and the inevitable passage into death. These moments, though brief, highlighted the paradoxical humanity within a role shrouded in dread. Isolation defined much of his personal life. His family shared his marginalization, often living on the outskirts of town or in designated quarters near the gallows. Wives and children faced social stigma, forbidden from participating fully in communal activities, church services, or celebrations. Yet, within these constraints, families developed their own rhythms, creating spaces of intimacy and normalcy. Meals were structured, tools maintained, and rituals observed to provide emotional balance. In the quiet of his home, away from public scrutiny, the executioner and his family could reclaim a sense of humanity, a brief reprieve from the shadow that followed them. Ritual and superstition were intertwined with daily life. Many executioners maintained private prayers, blessed their tools, or observed specific customs before and after executions. These acts served both psychological and spiritual functions, offering a sense of protection, absolution, and control over forces beyond human comprehension. Superstition also dictated social behavior. Townspeople were advised to avoid direct contact, dogs might grow restless in his presence, and certain chores were considered inappropriate for those under his roof. These layered rituals structured his life, simultaneously reinforcing isolation while providing a framework for endurance and stability. The psychological toll of the work was immense. Repeated exposure to mortality, human suffering, and the moral weight of sanctioned killing required extraordinary resilience. Sleep was often haunted by memories of the condemned, their faces, final words, and the sensation of lives ending by his hand. Yet, over time, he developed mechanisms to cope. Rituals, meditation, and acts of quiet compassion allowed him to compartmentalize, creating mental spaces where he could process grief, maintain moral equilibrium, and continue his work without succumbing to despair. Despite societal fear and disdain, the executioner held a paradoxical form of power. He embodied the law, acting as its tangible executor, yet he existed outside normal social hierarchies. Nobles, clergy, and townsfolk alike were reminded of their mortality through his presence. In each act he reinforced authority, morality, and communal order. Yet, this power was constrained by ritual, law, and expectation. Missteps could bring scandal or divine disfavor. Mastery required not only physical skill but psychological acuity, a steady moral compass, and an unwavering sense of duty. Compassion found its place in unexpected ways. While the executioner's primary role was to end life, he also preserved dignity whenever possible. Adjusting the noose, ensuring a swift blow, or offering final words of reassurance were subtle acts of mercy that went unseen by the masses. Such gestures were a quiet assertion of humanity within a profession defined by death. They reinforced a personal ethic that allowed him to navigate the moral complexities of his role, balancing public fear with private conscience. Ultimately, the executioner's existence was a study in paradox. He was at once necessary and despised, isolated yet central, feared yet indispensable. His life intertwined with law, ritual, and morality, bridging the living and the dead. In his daily routines, in the careful preparation of tools, and in the quiet reflection of his nights, he carried the weight of a society's fears and its need for justice. Though cursed in reputation, the executioner embodied endurance, precision, and a solemn dignity that preserved the fragile balance of medieval life. The executioner's craft was a complex interplay of precision, ritual, and observation, demanding mastery over both body and mind. Every motion had to be deliberate, every tool maintained meticulously. The axe, rope, and scaffold were not mere instruments. They were extensions of his skill, each calibrated to ensure a swift, controlled, and effective execution. Years of experience honed his movements into near perfection. He could sense the slightest imbalance in a scaffold, the fraying of a rope, or the improper posture of a condemned prisoner. His hands, steady and precise, performed the delicate choreography required to maintain dignity and minimize suffering, even in acts inherently violent and feared. Beyond technical skill, the executioner had to manage the emotional landscape of the condemned. Each prisoner arrived with a unique story, temperament, and fear. Some trembled uncontrollably, eyes wide with desperation. Others met death with pride, courage, or defiance. Reading these subtle cues was crucial. A poorly timed word, a misplaced gesture, or a moment of hesitation could provoke panic or resistance. The executioner needed not only physical control but psychological insight, the ability to guide a human being through the final, irreversible moment of life. This delicate balance between firmness and empathy defined the art of execution. Preparation extended beyond the condemned themselves. The public, too, needed to witness order. The scaffold had to be constructed with precision, lines marked where the prisoner would stand, ropes measured and knots tested. Bells tolled according to custom, marking the rhythm of the ritual, and clergy offered prayers, sanctifying the proceedings. The executioner coordinated with guards, priests, and sometimes municipal officials to ensure the process was seamless. Any mistake could not only cause a failed execution but disrupt the town's perception of justice. In these moments, the executioner acted as the pivot upon which law, morality, and social order turned. Isolation and social ostracization shaped his personal life. His family shared the burden of fear and stigma. Children were instructed to keep distance from peers, wives navigated whispered slights, and household interactions were marked by careful observation. Within the home, rituals offered a fragile semblance of normalcy, meals structured to preserve order, tools cleaned and arranged in precise ways, prayers recited at set intervals. Even in private, life revolved around preparation for duties, reflection on past acts, and the quiet management of the psychological weight that came with daily proximity to death. Rituals provided both practical and spiritual support. Many executioners observed prayers before each act, blessing their tools or offering silent intercessions for the condemned. Legends warned that neglecting such rituals could bring misfortune, either personal or divine. These observances offered a sense of control and protection, helping to reconcile the moral ambiguity of a life spent ending others' lives. In a world where superstition and reality intertwined, ritual became a tool for emotional and spiritual survival, a quiet anchor amidst the chaos of human mortality. The psychological toll was constant and multifaceted. Repeated exposure to fear, suffering, and mortality created a burden few could comprehend. Sleep was often restless, haunted by the faces and last words of the condemned. Over time, however, the executioner developed coping mechanisms, compartmentalization, meditation, and ritualized acts of compassion. These strategies allowed him to continue his work without being consumed by guilt, balancing professional duty with the human need for conscience and emotional stability. Despite fear and marginalization, the executioner wielded a subtle but undeniable influence. He embodied law, authority, and the moral framework of the town. His actions validated the judgments of rulers, clergy, and magistrates, reinforcing obedience and the consequences of transgression. The public's fear underscored his importance, and the very isolation imposed upon him amplified the perception of his power. Every execution, every display, every ritualized motion served as a reminder that order was maintained not only by law but through the disciplined application of lethal authority. Compassion was embedded in nuance. Adjusting the noose, ensuring a swift beheading, or offering a brief word of solace were subtle interventions that preserved dignity. These actions often went unnoticed by onlookers but reflected the executioner's humanity and ethical framework. They allowed him to navigate the tension between societal expectation and moral responsibility, infusing his work with a quiet sense of balance and ethical consideration. The executioner's awareness of mortality extended beyond his immediate duties. Observing the condemned, witnessing the crowd, and participating in ritualized death imbued him with insight into human behavior and societal structure. He saw courage, cowardice, repentance, and defiance in vivid relief, gaining an understanding of life and death that few others could claim. His existence, though shadowed by fear and stigma, offered clarity about human nature, morality, and the consequences of action. Ultimately, the executioner's life was a study in contradictions and resilience. Hated yet essential, feared yet respected, isolated yet central, he navigated a world in which law, ritual, and morality intersected at the point of the scaffold. Each day, he balanced precision with empathy, ritual with pragmatism, and fear with duty. Though burdened by reputation and proximity to mortality, he endured, carrying out responsibilities with skill, dignity, and an unacknowledged nobility. In this way, the executioner upheld not only justice but the fragile social order that defined medieval life. The executioner's existence was defined by paradox, a life suspended between fear and necessity, isolation and indispensability, mortality and duty. In every medieval town, his presence was a silent yet palpable force, a reminder that life could end swiftly, publicly, and inevitably. Children whispered tales of his fearsome skill, adults offered cautious gestures of respect, and even nobility acknowledged his role in maintaining the fragile fabric of society. Yet, behind the mask of dread, the executioner navigated an existence governed by discipline, ritual, and profound awareness of human frailty. His work required not only technical skill but moral insight, empathy, and psychological acuity, for the lives in his hands were both finite and consequential. The scaffold was the stage upon which his life and the lives of the condemned intersected. Each execution was a ritual, meticulously prepared and executed with precision. Ropes were measured, knots inspected, blades sharpened, and the scaffold itself reinforced to prevent mishap. Every movement carried weight. Any error could result in unnecessary suffering or public scandal. The executioner had to coordinate seamlessly with priests, guards, and officials, ensuring the act adhered to both legal and spiritual expectations. In this way, his work extended beyond physical violence, encompassing moral authority, psychological management, and the orchestration of communal order. Interaction with the condemned required acute perception. Every prisoner brought a unique story, temperament, and final desire. Some arrived trembling, eyes wide with terror. Others met death with defiance or solemn resignation. The executioner read these subtle cues, adjusting his approach to maintain control, minimize suffering, and preserve the integrity of the ritual. Words were measured carefully, gestures deliberate. Timing was everything. Even a slight miscalculation could provoke panic or resistance, threatening not only the procedure but the town's perception of justice. In mastering these interactions, the executioner became both guardian and guide, escorting souls to the boundary between life and death. Isolation shaped the executioner's personal life profoundly. Families often lived on the outskirts of town or near the gallows, shielded by distance yet burdened by stigma. Children were cautioned against forming normal social bonds. Wives navigated subtle exclusion from communal life. Within their homes, routines were structured to impose order and provide solace. Meals meticulously prepared, tools cleaned and arranged, prayers recited with consistency. In these domestic rituals, the executioner and his family found moments of quiet humanity, fleeting reprieves from the shadow that hung over them daily. Their lives became a delicate choreography of balance between public necessity and private survival. Superstition intertwined with daily practice. Executioners maintained prayers, blessed tools, and followed customs designed to avert misfortune or divine disfavor. Townspeople observed their own rituals, avoiding the executioner's touch or gaze, while animals seemed to sense the unnatural weight he carried. Such beliefs reinforced isolation but also structured life, providing psychological and spiritual frameworks to navigate a profession intertwined with death. Ritual and superstition became tools of endurance, offering the executioner a measure of control over the otherwise uncontrollable presence of mortality. Psychologically, the toll was immense. Repeated exposure to fear, suffering, and death created layers of emotional burden. Sleep was haunted by faces, voices, and final words, yet over time, the executioner developed resilience through ritual, reflection, and quiet acts of compassion. Subtle gestures, adjusting a rope, ensuring a swift stroke, offering a word of solace, were forms of ethical navigation, allowing him to reconcile societal expectation with personal morality. In these moments, the executioner exercised the rare human skill of empathy within the framework of lethal authority. His influence, though largely hidden, extended through the fabric of medieval life. He enforced law, validated authority, and maintained social equilibrium. Each execution reminded the community that actions carried consequences and that morality and obedience were tangible, enforceable constructs. Though feared, his presence was central, shaping both individual behavior and collective perception. He wielded a quiet power, one derived from technical mastery, psychological insight, and unwavering adherence to ritual, law, and social expectation. Life beyond the scaffold was filled with reflection and subtle acts of humanity. The executioner observed courage and despair, defiance and resignation, gaining insight into human nature few could claim. His proximity to mortality provided clarity. He understood the fragility of life, the fleeting nature of human ambition, and the profound weight of conscience. In private, he processed these observations, maintained tools, and recited prayers, preserving balance in a life that oscillated between visibility and marginalization, duty and isolation. Ultimately, the executioner embodied resilience and paradox. Hated yet essential, feared yet indispensable, he existed as both participant and observer in the drama of life and death. His work preserved the fragile order of society, reinforced morality, and enforced justice with precision and dignity. Though burdened by reputation and proximity to death, he endured with a quiet nobility, mastering the interplay between ritual, compassion, and authority. In doing so, he carried the weight of medieval life itself, balancing the inevitabilities of mortality with the responsibilities of a profession that defined his existence and the order of the communities he served. The executioner's life was a tapestry woven from fear, duty, isolation, and the subtle exercise of power. From the moment he took up the axe or measured the rope, he existed in a world of paradoxes. He was essential to the maintenance of law and order, yet scorned by the very society that depended upon him. He was feared by children, avoided by neighbors, and whispered about by townsfolk, yet he held a position of undeniable authority. Every execution was not only a fulfillment of civic duty but a ritual performance that affirmed the moral and social structure of the community. To witness him in action was to confront mortality in its most immediate and visceral form, to see life's fragility laid bare before an attentive crowd. The technical mastery required for his work was immense. Axes needed perfect balance, ropes measured with precision, and scaffolds constructed to bear both weight and ritual expectations. Each movement was honed through repetition, observation, and experience. The executioner's body became an instrument of exactitude, a swing of the axe calculated for a swift, clean cut, a drop of the condemned measured to avoid prolonged suffering, a knot tied with precision to secure life's final suspension. This was a craft that demanded both physical skill and acute awareness of human anatomy, psychology, and the mechanics of death itself. Yet the executioner's role was not purely mechanical. Each prisoner brought a unique narrative, fear, defiance, repentance, or resignation, and the executioner had to navigate these with subtlety. Timing, words, and gestures were carefully orchestrated to maintain control, provide minimal comfort, and ensure the act's ritual integrity. The condemned often projected their last emotions upon him, testing his patience, skill, and empathy. He became a guide, a silent mediator between the living and the inevitable passage into death, balancing duty with humanity in every interaction. Ritual was central to every act. Bells tolled to mark the passage of time, priests recited prayers, and townsfolk observed silently, internalizing the lesson of mortality. Executioners adhered strictly to these customs, not merely out of obedience but because the rituals themselves provided structure, focus, and a moral framework. Beyond the public spectacle, private rituals, blessings, prayers, and quiet reflection reinforced a sense of purpose and mitigated the psychological burden. Life, death, and morality converged in these practices, creating an intricate dance that defined the executioner's daily existence. Isolation and stigma shaped his domestic life. Families lived on the town's periphery or near the gallows, segregated by necessity and superstition. Children faced social constraints. Wives endured subtle exclusion. The household operated under strict routines that balanced domestic normalcy with the ever-present shadow of death. Meals were structured, tools maintained, and prayers recited regularly. Within these small, deliberate acts, the executioner and his family carved out spaces of humanity and emotional resilience, preserving dignity against the oppressive weight of public perception and professional responsibility. Superstition pervaded his work. Executioners were believed to carry a shadow of death, a presence that could curse crops, livestock, or unwary souls. Avoidance, rituals, and prayers became tools to manage both real and perceived dangers. The executioner learned to navigate these beliefs, understanding that his survival and the community's order depended as much on perception and ritual as on technical skill. These invisible boundaries reinforced isolation while providing a framework for psychological endurance, offering a delicate balance between fear, respect, and moral accountability. The psychological burden of repeated exposure to death was profound. Each execution left impressions, faces frozen in terror, final words lingering, and moments of defiance or resignation etched into memory. Sleep often offered no respite. Nightmares replayed the scaffold, the swing of the axe, and the stillness of departed souls. Yet, over time, the executioner developed resilience. Ritual, reflection, and subtle acts of compassion, adjusting a noose, ensuring swift death, or offering a word of solace, allowed him to reconcile the demands of duty with his conscience. These practices became essential for sustaining both mental stability and professional precision. Despite societal fear and marginalization, the executioner's role was central to social and legal order. He embodied the law, validated authority, and reinforced the consequences of transgression. Every execution was a lesson in obedience, morality, and the weight of action, broadcast vividly to the community. In performing his duties with precision, empathy, and ritual adherence, the executioner maintained the fragile equilibrium upon which medieval society rested. He was indispensable, yet hidden in plain sight, a figure whose presence ensured both order and moral clarity. Compassion, though subtle, permeated his work. The executioner preserved dignity whenever possible, offering quiet guidance, swift resolution, and discreet gestures of mercy. These acts, invisible to most, were vital for his own moral balance and allowed him to navigate the ethical tension inherent in a life defined by sanctioned death. They affirmed a personal code of humanity and restraint, balancing the grim reality of his profession with the acknowledgement of each condemned life's intrinsic value. Ultimately, the executioner's life was a profound study in paradox, resilience, and the human condition. Hated yet essential, feared yet respected, isolated yet central, he maintained the delicate balance between mortality, morality, and societal order. His craft required precision, empathy, and adherence to ritual, while his existence demanded psychological endurance and ethical navigation. Through daily repetition, reflection, and disciplined action, the executioner upheld not only the law but the fragile moral and social framework of medieval life. In his shadowed world, he bore witness to humanity's extremes: courage, fear, defiance, and surrender, and through his work, preserved the equilibrium upon which society itself depended. The life of a medieval executioner was an existence defined by extremes of fear and necessity, isolation and indispensability, mortality and responsibility. Unlike any other profession, the executioner stood at the very edge of society, a living embodiment of its laws, moral codes, and superstitions. His presence marked the boundary between life and death, justice and chaos, ritual and reality. Children whispered rumors and legends about him, their imaginations inflamed by his terrifying reputation, while adults approached with caution, offering gestures of respect or appeasement to avoid invoking his shadow. Nobles and magistrates relied upon his skill and discipline, understanding that the very survival of social order rested upon the precise fulfillment of his duties. To witness him at work was to confront the unvarnished reality of mortality. To live as he did was to bear a burden few could comprehend. Every day demanded preparation, focus, and unwavering attention to detail. His tools, the axe, the sword, the rope, and the scaffold itself, were extensions of his body and mind. Each required meticulous care. Axes sharpened to a perfect edge, ropes measured and knotted with precision, scaffolds inspected and reinforced. Any deviation could result in error, unnecessary suffering, or public scandal. Years of experience honed his movements into a dance of exactitude. His hands and eyes developed a precision that seemed almost preternatural. He could detect a frayed fiber in a rope, sense a misalignment in a scaffold, or anticipate a prisoner's panic before it surfaced. The executioner's craft combined physical skill, anatomical knowledge, and psychological acuity, forming a discipline that few outside his profession could fully grasp. Yet technical mastery alone was insufficient. Each prisoner carried a unique story, temperament, and state of mind, and the executioner had to navigate these subtleties with care. Some arrived in terror, their eyes wide and hands trembling, begging for mercy or the promise of a swift end. Others displayed defiance, pride, or resignation, their last moments marked by stoicism or rage. Observing these cues, he adjusted his approach, timing, words, gestures, to maintain control, minimize suffering, and uphold the integrity of the ritual. In these moments, the executioner acted as a silent mediator, escorting souls from life to death while maintaining the dignity of the act and the social order it represented. Ritual infused every aspect of his work. Bells tolled to mark the rhythm of proceedings, priests recited prayers, sanctifying the act, and townsfolk observed, learning both fear and respect for the consequences of transgression. The scaffold itself became a stage for moral theater, where the law was enacted with precision and spectacle. Executioners adhered to these rituals not merely as obedience but because the structure they imposed provided focus, discipline, and moral grounding. In private, they engaged in further ritual, blessings, prayers, and quiet reflection that allowed them to reconcile the moral weight of their work with their conscience. These practices were vital, providing both structure and spiritual solace in a profession defined by death. Isolation and social ostracization shaped the executioner's personal life. Families often resided on the periphery of towns or near the gallows, segregated by custom, necessity, and superstition. Children were instructed to keep distance from peers, wives endured subtle exclusion, and household interactions followed strict routines. Meals were meticulously prepared, tools cleaned and arranged, and prayers recited at regular intervals. In this carefully maintained domestic sphere, the executioner and his family carved out pockets of normalcy and humanity. The shadow of his profession, though ever present, was mitigated by these structured routines, which offered emotional resilience and stability. Superstition permeated his existence. Legends suggested that executioners carried a shadow of death with them, capable of bringing misfortune to crops, livestock, or unwary townspeople. Avoidance, prayers, and small rituals became essential tools for survival. These beliefs reinforced social distance but also provided a framework for psychological endurance. In a world where the supernatural was as tangible as law, the executioner's careful adherence to ritual, both public and private, created a measure of control over the uncontrollable, a delicate balance between fear, respect, and moral responsibility. The psychological toll of repeated exposure to death was immense. Each execution etched memories into his mind, faces frozen in terror, the last words of the condemned, and the tense rhythm of the scaffold. Sleep offered little respite. Dreams often replayed the moments of mortality he had witnessed. Over time, however, the executioner developed coping mechanisms. Compartmentalization, meditation, prayer, and subtle acts of compassion, adjusting the noose, ensuring a swift blow, offering a word of solace, became strategies to navigate the moral complexity of his work. These acts preserved his own humanity while fulfilling the demands of his role, allowing him to reconcile professional duty with ethical conscience. His influence extended subtly but profoundly through the social fabric. The executioner validated the authority of rulers, clergy, and magistrates. Each act of punishment served as both deterrent and moral lesson, reinforcing obedience and communal norms. Even those who avoided him or whispered his name in fear understood the necessity of his role. Though marginalized, he was central to maintaining social equilibrium, wielding a quiet power derived from skill, ritual mastery, and the weight of his responsibilities. Compassion, though rarely visible to the public, was integral to the executioner's work. Maintaining the dignity of the condemned, a swift beheading, a carefully adjusted noose, a quiet word of reassurance, reflected his humanity and ethical judgment. These subtle interventions allowed him to navigate the tension between societal expectation and personal morality, preserving life's dignity even in the face of death. Such acts reinforced a personal code that balanced fear and authority with empathy and restraint. Observation and insight were byproducts of his work. Witnessing the extremes of human behavior, courage, fear, defiance, repentance, the executioner gained a clarity about human nature few could claim. His proximity to mortality provided understanding of ambition's fragility, conscience's weight, and life's fleeting nature. In these moments of reflection, often in solitude, he processed the moral and emotional resonance of his profession, preserving a balance that allowed him to continue functioning in a role that tested both body and spirit. Beyond the scaffold, the executioner's role sometimes extended to caretaking functions. He might serve as a healer, bonesetter, or midwife, applying anatomical knowledge gleaned from his work to save lives. This paradox, a bringer of death who also preserved life, highlighted the complexity of his existence. While feared and ostracized, he occasionally intervened in ways that demonstrated profound skill and compassion, revealing a depth of character often invisible to those outside his profession. Ritual, superstition, and meticulous preparation coalesced to provide the executioner with a framework for enduring his burdens. Repetition and discipline created resilience, while ethical and psychological strategies ensured he could navigate the moral ambiguity inherent in sanctioned killing. In this carefully orchestrated life, death was not merely an act of violence. It was a measured, ritualized, and morally contextualized event that reinforced societal order, moral norms, and personal survival. Ultimately, the executioner's life embodied resilience, paradox, and insight. Hated yet essential, feared yet indispensable, isolated yet central, he carried the weight of medieval society's laws, morality, and fears. His craft demanded precision, psychological acuity, and ethical sensitivity. His daily existence required reflection, ritual, and disciplined engagement with both mortality and morality. Through these practices, the executioner upheld the fragile balance upon which medieval life rested, demonstrating a quiet dignity and mastery that ensured not only the survival of social order but also the preservation of humanity in a profession defined by its proximity to death. The executioner's story is a testament to endurance and the human capacity to navigate extreme responsibility. In a society defined by superstition, ritual, and the omnipresence of mortality, he existed as both guardian and participant, executing justice while observing the moral and social consequences of each act. He bore witness to courage, fear, repentance, and resignation, internalizing lessons about life and humanity that few others could understand. His labor, though feared and stigmatized, preserved the community's ethical framework, maintained social cohesion, and embodied the delicate interplay between life, death, and the moral order that sustained medieval civilization. To live as a medieval executioner was to inhabit a world of contradictions. One foot in life, one in death. One hand wielding authority, the other extending compassion. One existence isolated, yet central to societal function. Each day, he balanced these forces with precision, ritual, and moral awareness, demonstrating an endurance and insight that transcended fear and stigma. His profession demanded mastery of tools, bodies, and minds, as well as the ability to navigate human emotion and communal expectation. Through discipline, reflection, and subtle acts of ethical judgment, the executioner sustained a society that relied upon his skill even as it shunned him, maintaining order in a world ever aware of life's fragility. In the final reckoning, the executioner was both cursed and indispensable, a living paradox whose work upheld law, morality, and social structure. The community feared him, the condemned relied upon his skill, and yet few understood the depth of his experience or the resilience required to survive in a profession defined by mortality. He mastered the interplay of fear, ritual, compassion, and precision, transforming a role often associated solely with dread into one imbued with discipline, dignity, and nuanced humanity. His life serves as a powerful reminder that even in professions defined by darkness and societal scorn, resilience, insight, and moral awareness can shine quietly, sustaining both the individual and the community they serve.